A long time ago, in the gentle hush of medieval Europe, a woman whispered truths too luminous for her time. Her name was Marguerite Porete, a mystic, a writer, a seeker of divine love. Tonight we drift into her world, a quiet world of fire, silence, and soul. At the edge of the 13th century, when Europe moved with the rhythms of bells and seasons, there lived a woman named Marguerite Porete. She came into a world ruled by structure, by parchment, church bells, and the slow turning of centuries. It was a time when thoughts were spoken softly and ideas passed quietly from hand to hand. Marguerite was born in the region of Hainaut, a place nestled between what we now call Belgium and northern France. It was a land of cobbled roads, weathered stone chapels, and long winter nights, a place shaped by faith, where people turned to prayer, not just in joy, but in every uncertainty, every silence. From her earliest years, Marguerite was drawn not to the outer rituals, but to the inner radiance of the divine. While many found God in Latin words chanted by candlelight, Marguerite listened instead to the still voice within her heart. She didn't seek a doctrine. She longed for union, for an intimacy with the eternal that defied the forms and boundaries of her time. She joined a community of Beguines, a quiet movement of religious women who lived spiritually committed lives without taking formal vows. The Beguines walked a path of devotion, not dogma. They cared for the sick, taught the young, and contemplated the mysteries of existence. It was among them that Marguerite's thoughts deepened. Her writings began to grow. She wrote in the language of the people, not in Latin, and this alone set her apart. Her words were for the heart, not just the scholar. She did not argue or preach. She simply revealed. In her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, Marguerite described a soul so in love with God, so dissolved in divine longing, that it surrendered entirely, not out of fear, but out of boundless love. It was a vision of faith without possession, a letting go of ego, of will, of the self entirely, a soul emptied out like a still lake, reflecting only the infinite. To Marguerite, this was not rebellion, it was beauty. But to the guardians of orthodoxy, it was dangerous. The church of the late 13th century was beginning to tighten. Fearful of spiritual wandering, of mysticism outside its control, it had started to draw lines in sand and stone. The Inquisition had already been born decades before. Heresies, real or imagined, were no longer met with debate, but with interrogation. And into this atmosphere, Marguerite's mirror began to travel. Hand-copied, quietly read, the book spread among those hungry for more than rote prayer. It passed from city to city, always whispering, never shouting. But its very softness disturbed the hierarchy. The idea that a soul could bypass priests, bypass penance, bypass the church entirely, and still find God was a flame in a dry forest. She was summoned, her book was condemned. The Archbishop of Cambrai, a figure of power and tradition, declared it heretical. He ordered it burned, and for a time, Marguerite disappeared. Her name, her words fell silent, but silence, like ashes, can carry embers. Years later, she re-emerged in Paris, the very heart of the theological world. Paris was not just a city, but a center of scholasticism, a place where intellect and doctrine were debated endlessly by men in robes. And into that city she walked, not to apologize, but to remain true. Her book still lived in her. Her love for the divine had not dimmed. And though she made no speeches, her presence drew attention once more. The inquisitors began to watch. Their questions turned to accusations. Marguerite would not recant. She would not condemn her own words. To the church, this was obstinacy. To her, it was integrity. What began as quiet devotion was now seen as defiance. But even in this, Marguerite did not raise her voice. She only continued to reflect the eternal, gently, like the surface of a moonlit lake. In the centuries to come, her name would nearly vanish, but for now she stood, still, inward, and ablaze with love. By the early 1300s, the air in Paris grew heavier with doctrine. What had once been a city of scholastic exploration was narrowing into a place of suspicion. Theologians debated fine points of dogma, and councils gathered not only to clarify, but to correct. In such a space, mysticism was rarely welcomed. It was examined, dissected, and, if it wandered too far, extinguished. Marguerite Porete, quiet and unwavering, had returned to this city like a candle into wind. Her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, had already been burned once. Still, she allowed it to live. She didn't hide it. She didn't deny it. She handed it to those who asked, not because she sought approval, but because she believed in its light. Her words weren't argument, they were offering, and that offering began, once again, to stir unease. The mirror spoke of a soul so absorbed in God that it had no need for virtue or will. A soul so surrendered that it no longer acted on its own, but was moved only by divine grace. To theologians, these were bold claims, too bold. They seemed to erase the church's structure, to deny the need for moral effort or obedience. They seemed to place the individual unaided and unmediated into the presence of the divine. And for those who guarded boundaries, this was not beauty. It was heresy. Inquisitors took notice. A formal investigation began, not of the book alone, but of the woman behind it. Marguerite was arrested. Some say it happened in 1308, though the exact date is lost in the shadows of old parchment. What we do know is that she was held in a Parisian prison, not for days or weeks, but for over a year. Inside the stone walls, time must have passed differently. The world of stars, silence, and inner stillness was now replaced by echoing steps, barred windows, and the distant clamor of a city she could no longer see. And yet, she remained composed, not defiant, not afraid, composed. Interrogators came and went. Some were theologians, others inquisitors appointed by the church. They asked her to recant, to withdraw her words, to denounce the mirror. She refused, not with rebellion, but with calm conviction. She would not speak against what she believed was truth. Her silence became its own kind of testimony. Eventually, the church convened a formal trial. 7 bishops gathered, learned men, guardians of orthodoxy, and before them stood a woman, unlettered in their terms, unordained, and, most troubling of all, unyielding. Marguerite did not argue. She did not plead. The bishops questioned the content of her book. They parsed her phrases. They highlighted passages they found troubling. Again, they asked her to disown the mirror. Again, she did not. To them, her refusal to submit was proof enough. In June of 1310, her fate was sealed. The verdict was pronounced heresy. Not merely for her words, but for her persistence, for speaking as a woman, for writing without license, for continuing to circulate a text that had been condemned, for refusing to bow. And so the church passed sentence, not in the quiet halls of theology, but in the public square. Marguerite was to be burned. It is a strange thing to imagine. A woman whose central message was the annihilation of ego, the surrender to divine love, being marched to a scaffold built of wood and judgment. But that is what history tells us. On the 1st of June, 1310, in the Place de Grève, an open space along the Seine where executions were sometimes carried out, Marguerite Porete was led to her death. Accounts of that day are sparse. Much was lost to time. But a few details remain. Some say she was calm, that she walked without protest, that even as flames rose, her face did not twist in agony, but remained serene. One chronicler writes that she was seen smiling, a gentle curve of peace, even in the rising heat. Was it pain or transcendence? We cannot know. What we do know is that she burned not for violence, nor for hatred, but for love. Her body turned to ash in a city that could not hold her truth. But her words, they did not die. Copies of the Mirror of Simple Souls survived, hidden, carried, passed from hand to quiet hand. It would be many years before it re-emerged in full, but it did. And in that persistence, Marguerite remained, still reflecting, still burning, still whole. Long after the ashes of that June day scattered into the Parisian air, the memory of Marguerite Porete seemed to vanish. There were no statues, no sermons in her honor, only silence, the silence of a world not yet ready to hold what she had carried. But silence does not always mean absence. For while her name receded from the public record, the Mirror of Simple Souls endured in obscurity. Quietly and in fragments, it began to travel again, across borders, through monastic libraries, between mystics and seekers who recognized in its pages something wordless and eternal. Unlike the rigid theological treatises of her time, Marguerite's writing was like water, soft, flowing, and profoundly reflective. She did not construct arguments. She invited the reader into a stillness. She spoke of a soul emptied of self, emptied even of virtue, until only love remained. Not the sentimental love of poetry or romance, but a boundless, formless flame that consumed the soul so thoroughly it became indistinguishable from the divine itself. In her vision, this soul no longer performed acts of will, not even good deeds or penitence, for all such efforts were rooted in separation. Instead, the soul rested in a sacred nothingness, a luminous unknowing. This, she taught, was the final stage of spiritual union, beyond prayer, beyond fear, beyond self. For some, this was liberation. For others, blasphemy. What made her message so quietly radical was its invitation. It was not reserved for monks or bishops, not confined to cloisters or councils. It was open to anyone who dared to listen, not to her, but to the silence within. In the centuries that followed, other mystics would echo parts of her teaching, perhaps knowingly, perhaps not. Meister Eckhart in Germany, Hadewijk in the Low Countries, and later the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing in England. Each in their own way spoke of surrender, of divine darkness, of the soul's descent into love. But Marguerite had said it with a clarity and simplicity that was rare and dangerous. Still, her book persisted. One copy surfaced in a Carthusian monastery in the late 1400s. Another was found in an English translation, attributed not to her, but to an unknown mystic. In time, even scholars would forget who had written it. The Mirror had become, paradoxically, authorless, just as its message taught the soul to become. Centuries passed, the world changed, empires rose and fell. The printing press turned quiet manuscripts into widespread texts. Wars were fought over the very faith Marguerite had sought to transcend. Reformations and counter-reformations drew new boundaries around belief. And still, the Mirror remained, always moving beneath the surface, like an underground stream. In the 20th century, long after her name had nearly disappeared from historical memory, researchers began to rediscover her. Through the work of historians, theologians, and literary scholars, Marguerite Porete was once again recognized, not as a heretic, but as a mystic, not as a rebel, but as a writer of rare insight. Her words were translated, studied, and quietly absorbed by new generations of spiritual seekers. And slowly her story came back into view. She was no longer just the woman who burned. but the woman who wrote, the woman who waited, the woman who trusted in silence more than safety. In a modern world often filled with noise and urgency, her teachings offer something deeply countercultural. Not solutions, not promises, only presence, the kind that doesn't seek, but simply is. The mirror does not instruct us to act or to build or even to believe. It asks us to let go, to surrender, not out of despair, but out of overflowing trust, to release not only fear and pain, but even virtue and identity, to fall, like a single leaf, into the vastness of divine love. It is not an easy teaching. It is not one that fits neatly into doctrines or creeds. But for those who listen, it opens something still and luminous, a door without hinges, a fire that does not burn but dissolves. And perhaps that is why Marguerite was so threatening. Because her faith was not a tool of control, but an act of complete inward freedom, a mirror held not to the world, but to the soul, still shining, still reflecting, still open. In the long flow of spiritual history, Marguerite Poret's life seems like a solitary ripple. A woman alone, a book burned, a name nearly erased. And yet the ripple spread, softly, quietly, invisibly, into the contemplative undercurrent of Christian mysticism. She had not belonged to any formal order. She was not a nun, nor a canoness. She was a Beguine, part of a loosely bound, deeply spiritual movement of women who lived lives of simplicity and inward devotion, often outside the walls of monasteries. These women, like Marguerite, chose to walk their own path between the secular and the sacred, between the world and the cloister. It was a delicate space, rich in insight, yet vulnerable to scrutiny. Beguines flourished in the Low Countries and northern France during the 12th and 13th centuries. They cared for the sick, educated children, lived communally or alone, and devoted themselves to prayer without the constraints of formal vows. Their spirituality was often deeply experiential, rooted not in rigid dogma, but in direct encounter. Many wrote poetry, prayers, and visions, often in the vernacular, the language of the people, rather than Latin. This was a profound shift, to speak of God not as an abstract concept but as a living, breathing presence, to describe not rules but longing, not commandments but intimacy. Marguerite's mirror stood firmly within this current, but it also moved beyond it. Where others spoke of divine love as rapture or yearning, Marguerite wrote of annihilation, not destruction, but the gentle dissolving of the self into God. The soul, she taught, must empty itself of everything, even its desire for heaven or salvation, until nothing remained but love alone. It was a radical silence at the heart of her vision, a sacred nothingness. To the mystical ear, it was familiar, resonant. To the institutional mind, it was dangerous, because it stripped away all scaffolding, ritual, virtue, merit, fear, and left only the bare flame of grace. And yet, though the church condemned her, others were listening. In the same century, the German mystic Meister Eckhart would speak of the ground of the soul, a place where God is born anew in silence. He too would be investigated. He too would leave behind teachings that hovered at the edge of acceptance. It is unknown whether Eckhart ever read Marguerite's words, but the echoes between them are undeniable. Later, in England, the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing would describe the path to God as one of unknowing, of forgetting all that can be grasped or named, a journey not of knowledge, but of surrender. In Spain, centuries later, St. John of the Cross would write of the dark night of the soul, a phrase that now lives on in countless contemplative traditions. In his poetry and prose, we find again the stripping away, the silent yearning, the soul left bare before the divine. These mystics, separated by time, language, and culture were all moving in the same direction, not outward but inward, not toward certainty but toward love without form. Marguerite's voice, among theirs, remains perhaps the most unyielding because she did not temper her message. She offered no middle ground. The soul, she said, must die to itself completely, not once, but again and again, until no image, no will, no separation remains. It is a teaching few embrace fully, but even when not embraced, it remains present, like a distant melody that lingers long after it is played. In the centuries that followed, the mirror would be copied, translated, and passed through hands that never knew the woman who wrote it. Her name was often stripped away, her life forgotten, but the words endured. In a monastery in Paris, in a quiet scriptorium in England, in a library in the Rhineland, the mirror found its resting places, and each time it was opened, something ancient stirred. Even today, the mirror of simple souls speaks not to the intellect, but to the silence beneath thought. It does not instruct, it invites. It does not command, it waits. In a world of noise, this waiting is its own kind of revolution, and perhaps that is the secret of Marguerite's endurance. She did not build a following. She left no grand theology, only a stillness, only a fire, only a mirror, one that asks nothing and yet reflects everything. Centuries have passed since Marguerite Porete was led through the streets of Paris, past the worn stone facades to the place where flame met flesh. That moment, sharp and final, might have seemed like the end, but it wasn't. It was only a passage, a quiet transition from voice to echo, from form to presence. History remembers her rarely. She is not enshrined in stained glass or carved into cathedral walls. Her feast day is not marked in liturgical calendars, and yet in the deep, still chambers of the contemplative heart, she remains, like a candle that refuses to go out, even in wind and forgetting. Marguerite's mirror, once condemned, now rests on library shelves beside the writings of saints and sages. But it does not demand to be read. It does not persuade. It simply waits, like a still pool in a forest clearing, reflecting only what approaches it gently. What draws modern readers to her work today is not drama, but depth, not theology, but experience. In a world increasingly shaped by urgency and noise, Marguerite's words invite a different rhythm, one of letting go not only of possessions, but of identity, not only of fear, but of effort, even of one's own goodness. This is the heart of her teaching, that the soul, in order to be fully united with God, must surrender everything, not in despair, but in a kind of radiant trust, a surrender that is not collapse, but completion. To many, this feels unfamiliar, perhaps even unsettling. We are taught to strive, to improve, to reach upward, but Marguerite invites the opposite. She invites the soul to descend, to release, to empty, to be nothing. She calls this the simple soul, not because it lacks wisdom, but because it has gone beyond all complexity, beyond self-image, beyond virtue, beyond striving. It simply is in God, as God, with no separation. In her vision, this simplicity is not childish. It is spacious, like the openness of a night sky, like silence before sound. It is the final flowering of a soul that has passed through every season and now comes to rest, not in death, but in divine fullness. This teaching resonates softly with traditions far beyond Marguerite's world. In the East, the sages of Advaita speak of the self dissolving into Brahman, the eternal, formless source. In Taoist thought, the wise do not strive, but follow the path of Wu Wei, effortless action, natural harmony. In Zen, the moment of Satori, awakening, arrives not with achievement, but with the quiet collapse of identity. Marguerite never studied these paths. She never traveled beyond the fields and cities of medieval Europe. And yet, her soul reached into that same eternal silence. She used the language she knew, Christian, mystical, poetic, but the truths she touched live beyond any boundary. It is perhaps no wonder, then, that her words reappear in times of spiritual hunger, in moments when old forms no longer hold and new ones feel too fragile to trust. Because Marguerite speaks not of institutions or systems, but of presence. Her legacy is not found in followers or movements, but in solitary moments. A reader sitting in silence by a window, a seeker letting go of a question they cannot answer, a mystic gazing at the stars, not asking for signs, but simply breathing in the night. Marguerite's gift is not instruction, but resonance. Her words act like tuning forks, silent until they strike a chord in the soul. And then, something begins to hum, softly, inwardly. She offers no ladder to climb, no steps to follow, only a mirror, and the invitation to look. In that mirror, the self slowly fades, and what remains is not emptiness, but fullness, not absence, but the ungraspable presence of love, without form, without reason, without end. The kind of love that does not burn out, the kind that burns through. There is a peculiar quality to truth when it is spoken in silence. It lingers. It doesn't shout or demand, yet it remains, hovering quietly in the folds of memory and intuition. Marguerite Porete lived such a truth, not in her title, not in her status, but in her soul's gentle insistence that love alone was enough. More than 7 centuries have passed since her final breath rose with the smoke over Paris. And yet she is closer than we might imagine. Not as a relic of history, but as a presence, a way of being, a whisper in the stillness between thoughts. Her mirror, once set to flame by human hands, now lives on in print, translation, and study. But more than that, it lives wherever a soul pauses, truly pauses, not to seek, but to rest, to release everything, even itself, into the vastness of the present moment. The path she described does not lead away from the world, but deeper into its heart. It is not a path of withdrawal, but of subtle transformation. In letting go, she taught, the soul does not become less, it becomes clear, like a polished mirror that no longer reflects its own dust, but only the light. Her words offer no shortcuts, no system, no quick comfort. They unfold like petals in the early morning, quietly and with patience. And perhaps that is why they remain so rare, so precious, even now. In the 21st century, amid the rush of digital noise and the architecture of performance, Marguerite's voice offers a different sound, a stillness that does not isolate but connects, a solitude that reveals unity. For in her deepest vision, there was no longer God and soul, no longer lover and beloved, only one flame, one essence, one quiet isness. She described it as a state beyond all attributes, beyond even love or light or truth. Words fell away, not because they failed, but because they were no longer needed, like a boat that is abandoned once the shore is reached. It is no wonder her teachings unsettled her time. She did not challenge the church's authority with argument. She simply moved past it, not with resistance, but with surrender. And that surrender, paradoxically, became her strength. When the bishops and inquisitors pressed her to denounce her work, she did not protest. She did not argue. She simply remained, calm, composed, utterly present. There was nothing to protect, nothing to prove. Only the echo of what had already been given. That calm was not indifference. It was not numbness. It was the peace that arrives when everything has been let go. It is said that she smiled as she was led to the flames. We cannot know for certain. But if she did, it was not a smile of defiance. It was the smile of one who had already crossed over. whose identity had already dissolved in love, who had become the mirror itself. And so, Marguerite's life ended not in tragedy, but in completion. She left behind no monument, no order bearing her name, only the mirror. And yet, what greater legacy could there be? Today, her readers are quiet souls, monastics, mystics, scholars, wanderers, people who have glimpsed the limits of achievement and desire and now seek a deeper home. They find her not on loud stages, but in the margins, in quiet rooms, in nights of still contemplation. And when they read her, something subtle happens, a loosening, a softening, a return. For Marguerite speaks to that part of us that already knows, that part which, beneath all striving and naming, longs simply to rest in what is. In that space, the mirror still shines, not because it holds answers, but because it reflects presence, not because it offers reward, but because it removes distance. Marguerite's flame did not end at the scaffold. It was never fire that defined her. It was the space the fire revealed, empty, luminous, and whole.